A sliver of light cuts across his grin as he pockets my car keys without hesitation. The flickering bulb above us gutters in a way that feels deliberate, like it is forcing the moment to stutter, so I cannot look away from what he is doing or pretend I misunderstood it. The air in the hallway stands still thickening around the quiet scrape of metal against fabric as he settles the keys deeper into his pocket. I watch the movement with the strange, suspended clarity that comes only when a boundary is crossed in silence rather than words, a clarity that freezes the world long enough to let me witness the exact second something shifts beyond repair. He doesn't hide the gesture. He doesn't laugh it off or justify it. He just slides the keys away as though they've always been his. His eyes stay on mine with an ease that tells me he expects no resistance from me, that he believes he owns not just the keys, but the air in this hallway, and perhaps even my response. I feel my pulse quicken, but I don't speak. Words would break the moment open too fast, and something in me wants to register its weight before it rushes past. The flickering bulb pulses again, carving broken lines of light along the walls and slicing his silhouette into fragments that move whenever I blink. It feels intentional, like the house is joining the confrontation even if I can't. He shifts his stance, leaning slightly on one heel in a way that signals confidence rather than hesitation. His voice when it comes is low and almost bored, drifting past me, as though the question of why he is taking my keys isn't worth acknowledging. He doesn't say he needs them. He doesn't ask permission. He doesn't offer explanation. He acts like this is a natural extension of his authority, something he was always entitled to, and the realization settles over me like dust coating an untouched chair. I think about speaking, about stepping forward, about inserting myself into the narrative he's trying to write over my silence. But the flickering bulb casts another jerk of light across his jawline, illuminating the exact crooked angle of his smirk, and it strips the impulse from me before it forms. I feel the house press in the scent of old paint and drier, warm air mingling into something strangely metallic, something that tastes like the moment before a storm breaks. He turns toward the door without breaking eye contact, still wearing that half grin that makes me realize he's enjoying how small this choice makes me feel. I want to tell myself I'm imagining the pleasure in his expression, but the way his eyelids lower ever so slightly as he tests my reaction tells me it's intentional. The flickering bulb above him crackles faintly enough to make me flinch even though he doesn't. Shadows wobble across his shoulders as he reaches for the lock. He disengages it with quiet precision, as if he's done it hundreds of times before. The door creaks only slightly when he opens it, and the night air slips in, brushing cold against my skin and reminding me that the outside world still exists, even if this hallway feels like a sealed chamber built for just the two of us. His hand rests on the doorknob for a second longer than necessary, and I notice the way his thumb taps it lightly, a small rhythm that signals satisfaction rather than nerves. Then he steps across the threshold, and for a moment the flickering bulb aligns perfectly with the shift of his body, creating a frozen tableau where he stands outlined by a trembling halo of light, my keys in his pocket, my voice trapped in my chest. The door closes slowly behind him, pushed not by force, but by intention. And the faint click of the latch feels like the final note of a song I didn't realize had been playing. The silence that follows is sharper than any sound could be. It stretches through the hallway, slipping into corners and gathering in places I won't be able to avoid later. I stay still for a long moment, letting the present tense settle around me like dust illuminated by the uncertain glow of the flickering bulb. Each fragment suspended, each one reminding me that something has changed and that change has teeth. I know he expects me to stay silent. I know he's counting on it. But the last tremor of light from the bulb fractures across the door's surface, splitting into thin, trembling lines that refuse to hold steady, and I understand that the moment isn't just about the keys. It's about the ease with which he takes what isn't his, the certainty with which he assumes I'll let him, and the truth that this hallway, this exact second, is the beginning of something neither of us will be able to undo. The present holds me there trapped between shadow and light, waiting for a consequence I'm not sure I'm ready to acknowledge but can no longer pretend isn't coming. The flickering bulb dims once brightens again, and the stillness becomes a promise the house refuses to swallow. I'm Elena Ward, 33, an ICU nurse from Raleigh, North Carolina, and when I think back to the days before everything fractured, the memory settles in past tense like a film reel. Someone forgot to rewind the colors softer, but not softened enough to hide the truth beneath them. The cold doorknob was the first detail that didn't make sense, though. At the time, it felt like nothing more than a small discomfort against my palm, a chilled piece of metal on a mild evening that should have been warm enough to erase any reason for it to feel that way. A thin reflection slides across the doorway like it's watching us. I didn't understand it, then didn't register the subtle warning inside that narrow streak of light the way it hovered, and then vanished as though the house itself attempted to alert me of something shifting beneath the surface. Back then, the evening settled gently over the rooms, softening the edges of worn furniture and dimming the yellow glow from the kitchen light into something comforting. Darren still played the part of a husband who came home at expected times, who asked predictable questions, who laughed in the way people laugh when they want a room to sound normal instead of be normal. The routine of it all formed a rhythm I depended on more than I realized. I worked long shifts in a unit where time often stretched painfully wrapped in alarms and urgency, so returning home to that rhythm felt like relief, even if the relief was thin. Lorraine visited more often than anyone invited her to, drifting through the house like she was checking the condition of a place she believed belonged more to her son than to me. She spoke in overlapping suggestions disguised as concern, telling me which curtains trapped too much dust, which containers in the fridge looked expired, which shelves should be organized differently. Her hands always found the same drawer, pulling it open halfway with a soft scrape of wood that echoed faintly as if the drawer and the metal track beneath it recognized her touch better than mine. I used to think her restlessness came from boredom. I didn't yet understand that she was searching for ways to insert herself into the spaces I tried to keep balanced. Darren acted unaffected by her presence, following her suggestions with a dim smile that made me wonder if he liked the way she rearranged the world around us. He'd toss his keys on the entry table, the sound barely audible above the hum of the refrigerator or the distant traffic outside. Mine stayed in my bag untouched, unless I needed them, their small weight stable and familiar one of the few constants that belonged only to me. The house held warmth, then a soft hum of ordinary life. When I stood in the hallway after long shifts, my body aching and my eyes blurry, the last thing I expected was change. I'd set my bag down, stretch my stiff shoulders, and breathe in the scent of detergent lingering from freshly washed towels. Even Darren's voice, slightly too warm, slightly too controlled, slipped through the rooms in a way that didn't yet scrape against my nerves. But small moments began to surface, quiet things at the edges of routine. Darren watching me a beat too long after asking an ordinary question. Lorraine slipping a comment into a conversation that didn't belong to her. The cold doorknob that didn't fit the season. The reflection that moved even though I didn't. Those details floated through the calm like dust motes, noticeable only when the light caught them at the right angle. I brushed them away at first. Fatigue explains everything when you work the hours I do. Emotional fog makes even sharp edges look dull. But sometimes a detail lingers long after the moment that produced it, and I didn't realize how many of those details were collecting until much later. In those earlier days, Darren leaned on the kitchen counter and told stories about work, always with a tone crafted to make himself sound indispensable. He described co-workers who depended on him, clients who trusted him, supervisors who misunderstood him. He never admitted fault, not once, not in the years we'd been together. It wasn't noticeable at first. It wasn't threatening. It was just part of who he was, or so I thought. The house absorbed all of it, the laughter, the tension, the forced politeness with Lorraine, the small pauses before Darren answered certain questions, the faint chill in objects that shouldn't have been cold. Everything blended quietly into the days, forming a backdrop I never questioned. If there were cracks forming, they spread noiselessly beneath the wallpaper. If something was shifting, it moved slowly, so slowly that even standing in the middle of it, I didn't see the shape taking form around me. Looking back, the calm wasn't calm at all. It was silence, held tight around a truth, waiting for someone to stop pretending it wasn't there. And the first sign of that truth wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a cold piece of metal beneath my hand, and a thin reflection sliding across a doorway, watching us like it already knew what I refused to admit. The first fracture didn't arrive with shouting or accusations. It arrived quietly, slipping into the evening like a draft through a window I didn't realize had been left open, and even now the memory settles in past tense with the clarity of something that had always been waiting to reveal itself. I came home from a double shift, my shoulders aching from hours of tension I hadn't had time to process, and the house greeted me with an unusual stillness that pressed against my skin before I even stepped fully inside. My bag felt lighter than it should have, a subtle difference that at first I blamed on exhaustion, but the moment I placed it on the table, the truth began to push forward. I opened the zipper and reached inside with the muscle memory of 1,000 days expecting the familiar weight of my keys brushing against my fingers. Instead, my fingertips landed on fabric and empty space, the absence so stark it sent a small spark of confusion up my spine. I checked the side pocket, then the front compartment, then the bottom, each search more frantic than the last. Logic fought to steady me. Maybe I had moved them. Maybe I'd been distracted during shift change, but a quiet pressure told me this wasn't forgetfulness. When I finally pulled out my phone to check the time, a notification blinked across the screen, its brightness cutting through the dim of the kitchen like a warning I hadn't prepared for. Security alert, unauthorized GPS access on my car, Refi HX91, logged at 21:14. I stared at the screenshot, the timestamp glowing with an eerie precision that refused to let me twist it into anything harmless. The tremble in my hands wasn't dramatic, just a small shiver of recognition that something was wrong in a way I couldn't yet define. Darren entered the room with the kind of casual timing that would have seemed ordinary on any other night, but the moment he saw the phone in my hand, a subtle twitch flickered across his expression. He tried to hide it with a soft smile, the kind he used when he wanted to nudge reality into a shape more favorable to him, but it didn't fit the moment, and it didn't fit his eyes. He asked if everything was okay. His voice dipped in a gentle concern that felt carefully placed rather than genuine, and his fingers toyed with something in his pocket, a trembling key that clicked faintly against another piece of metal every time his hand shifted. The sound was small, but it carried through the room with the precision of a needle finding the exact place to pierce. He claimed he didn't know anything about a GPS alert. He suggested maybe the system glitched, maybe the app updated, maybe I clicked something by accident after my shift. His explanations came too quickly, overlapping each other in a way that felt less like reassurance and more like construction building a story plank by plank before I could assemble my own. When I asked why the key in his pocket was shaking against his hand, he laughed lightly, brushing it off as one of his work keys, though he never carried work keys, something he seemed to momentarily forget. His voice softened into that practiced tone he used whenever he sensed my suspicion rising, the one designed to convince rather than communicate, but the screenshot still glowed coldly between us, refusing to dim into something ignorable. I told him the timestamp didn't make sense. He countered with a shrug, shifting the trembling key back deeper into his pocket, as if he could muffle both its sound and its implication. The contradiction sat between us like a thin, sharp blade. His eyes darted briefly to the hallway, then back to me, calculating how much I had noticed, how much I had interpreted, how much I was willing to challenge. I tried to push down the unease to lean on fatigue as an explanation the way I had so many times before, because confronting the possibility of deception would require unraveling too much at once. But the screenshot burned through every excuse I tried to summon. Refer HX91, 21 to 14, unauthorized access. It wasn't vague or ambiguous or open to interpretation. It was precise, cold, exact. And he knew it. Darren stepped closer, lowering his voice into something soothing enough that months earlier I might have believed him. He reached out as if to touch my arm, but the gesture felt rehearsed, too fluid, too timed. I stepped away before he made contact, and for a split second something unfiltered slipped across his face, a flash of irritation, so quick most people would have missed it. But I didn't. The trembling key clinked again, betraying him in a way he hadn't prepared for. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, not to let a single alert dictate the narrative of our marriage, not to assume ill intent where there might only be confusion. But the fracture was already forming, hairline thin, but undeniable, expanding with every heartbeat. When I finally placed my phone on the counter, the screenshot remained open, its white background illuminating the kitchen like a sterile hospital light, exposing everything it touched. Darren lingered in the doorway for a moment longer, his silhouette stiffening as he realized I wasn't accepting his explanations. Then he slipped down the hallway, leaving the air behind him taut and trembling with the echo of that small metallic click in his pocket. I stood alone in the kitchen and let the fracture widen, knowing even then that this was the beginning of something I would no longer be able to unsee. The unraveling widened in a way I couldn't disguise anymore, and by the time the rain settled into a steady curtain outside, the day already carried the heavy weight of a moment waiting to expose something I hadn't been ready to face. When Mrs. Kent knocked on my door with a quick, urgent rhythm that didn't match her usual cautious manner, I felt the fracture from the night before, stretching thin enough to tear. I opened the door to find her standing beneath her umbrella, her small frame jittering with nerves rather than cold. She told me she needed to show me something, her words rushed and tangled, and she motioned for me to follow her across the small patch of wet grass separating our homes. The rain drummed on her umbrella, creating a steady beat that filled the silence I didn't know how to break. She led me to her porch, her fingers trembling slightly as she unlocked her phone. Her porch lamp flickered once, casting a narrow glow that reflected off the storm door. The glass reflection wavered along its surface like a silent warning, but I forced myself to stay still as she opened her camera app. Clip Chamonga number 12R timestamp 1946. She pressed play before giving me a chance to ask anything. The footage began with a sweep of her driveway, the rain still light, then tapping in uneven rhythms across the porch railing. A figure stepped into frame a moment later, Darren moving with calculated ease as he glanced around, checking the angles like someone accustomed to acting unseen. My stomach tightened hard as I watched him approach our house. His shoulders relaxed, his movements smooth, entirely devoid of panic or hesitation. He wasn't looking for anything. He knew exactly what he came for. He reached into my bag, the one I had set down the afternoon before, when exhaustion fogged my memory, and retrieved my car keys with a swift, confident motion. There was no fumbling, no second guessing. Just certainty. The porch lamp flickered again, and the thin glass reflection from Mrs. Kent's storm door cut a faint diagonal across his face, splitting his expression into two uneven halves. Light on one side, shadow on the other, and something inside me lurched at how fitting that image was. When the video ended, the rain had begun falling harder, pattering against the porch roof in a rhythm that made it harder to breathe. Mrs. Kent apologized before I had the chance to say anything. She said she hadn't wanted to get involved but felt wrong holding on to something she knew I deserved to see. Her voice quivered with the guilt of witnessing a truth she hadn't asked for. I thanked her quietly, even though the words barely made it past the pressure building in my chest. As I stood there, a few neighbors stepped onto their porches, drawn by the combination of weather and something unspoken in the air. Their gazes flickered between me and Mrs. Kent, not cruel, not mocking, just curious and heavy with the weight of understanding. Public exposure has a way of tightening around a person, even when no one says a word. I replayed the video in my mind while rainwater gathered at the edge of the porch, pooling into mirror-like puddles that distorted the reflections above them. Darren's ease, the steady motion of his hand, the calmness in his posture, none of it matched the confusion he had feigned the night before. He had known exactly what he was doing, and the lie had slipped from his mouth with the kind of precision that only comes from practice. Mrs. Kent asked softly whether I was all right, and for a moment I couldn't answer. The humiliation wasn't loud or dramatic. It settled beneath my skin, quietly weaving itself through every breath until the world felt too sharp. The rain blurred the edges of the street, the houses, the cars, but nothing blurred the clarity of what I'd seen. I told her thank you again and stepped back, my shoes tapping lightly against her porch floor. The porch lamp brightened briefly, catching the storm door just right, so the glass reflection stretched toward me one last time, as if pointing at the truth I couldn't outrun. As I walked home, each raindrop hit the ground with small, insistent finality. By the time I reached my door, the knowledge of what Darren had done and the ease with which he'd done it had carved itself into the quiet places inside me where trust used to live. The public stillness lingered long after the neighbors went back inside, holding the weight of a truth I could no longer pretend was a misunderstanding. The house felt different the moment I stepped back inside, as if the air itself had been holding its breath, waiting for the exact second humiliation followed me through the door. The quiet wasn't the usual kind that settles after rain. It was heavier, thick with an unspoken shift that clung to the walls. I could still feel the weight of the porch camera footage sitting on my skin, a cold reminder that the truth had been caught on film long before I allowed myself to believe it. I set my bag down slowly, listening to the faint settling noises of the house, as if they might offer some explanation I hadn't already seen. The truth echoed through every room. He took the keys. He lied. He did it without hesitation, and he expected me to doubt myself instead of him. Darren came home shortly after moving with a careful calm that immediately put me on edge. He offered a soft smile, the kind he had used for years, to smooth over moments he didn't intend to take responsibility for. It was too smooth this time, too polished. He told me he'd been out running errands, his tone light almost breezy, but his eyes kept drifting away from mine, flicking toward the living room and then the hallway as if searching for a version of events he could push me toward. I listened to his voice, trying to trace where the lie began, but every word felt flimsy, like tissue paper trying to hold back water. It didn't take long for the next fracture to widen. A knock sounded at the door, and without giving me a moment to steady myself, Lorraine stepped inside with the confidence of someone entering her own home. Her perfume preceded her sharp and floral, filling the room before her voice even sliced through the air. She greeted me with forced warmth, the kind that made every syllable feel like a performance. Then, without asking, she walked straight to the kitchen drawer, the same one she always touched, and pulled it half open. The familiar creak rippled through the room, turning the moment into something colder. The half-open drawer sat there like an exposed throat, revealing a stack of old mail and crumpled envelopes, marked with faint streaks of faded ink, reminders of small things I had overlooked for too long. I asked her why Darren had taken my keys. The question was simple. Direct. She didn't flinch. Instead, her expression smoothed over with practiced innocence as she claimed I had offered them to him earlier that week. Her voice was honeyed steady, layered with the unmistakable confidence of someone who believed her words would carry more weight than my memory. Darren didn't correct her. He didn't even pretend to seek accuracy. He kept his gaze low, letting her script the moment for him as he stood silently beside her. Their alignment hit me harder than the lie itself. Lorraine added details, fabricated times-imagined conversations, invented gestures, each one designed to make the version of reality she wanted sound indisputable. She said I must have forgotten because of my exhausting job. The words placed delicately but intentionally, as if my fatigue made me unreliable. Darren nodded occasionally, not enough to take ownership, but enough to support her narrative without risking his voice cracking under the weight of it. The half-open drawer remained behind her, its contents exposed in a way that felt symbolic. Those envelopes marked with streaks of faded ink seemed to watch the scene unfold like witnesses unable to speak. I noticed a letter I had written months ago but never mailed, the ink smudged by a drop of water or maybe a fingerprint. A small, fragile truth hiding beneath layers of reorganization Lorraine had always pretended was helpful. As they stood together in my kitchen shaping a story I knew was false, something inside me tightened. Their shared glances, their overlapping explanations, their synchronized denial. It all fit too neatly, too comfortably, like they had rehearsed this dynamic long before today. The lie wasn't clumsy, it was crafted. And their ease in delivering it made the room feel smaller, the air thinner, the truth sharper. When they finished speaking, neither of them waited for my response. Darren slipped away into the hallway, and Lorraine left the drawer half open as if to remind me how exposed the truth could become when someone else kept insisting they were the one who understood it better. I stood alone in the kitchen staring at that drawer, realizing how far they were willing to go to rewrite my reality and how deeply the fracture had now carved itself into the foundation of our home. The night settled over the house with a weight that felt deliberate, as though it had been waiting for the exact moment when quiet could become threatening, and even now the memory unfurls in past tense with a clarity sharpened by what I refused to admit earlier. I walked through the dim hallway, noticing the metallic shadow stretching across the wall in a way that startled me, a thin strip of shifting darkness that slid over the paint like something alive. It wasn't unusual for light to fall strangely in this house, but the shadow carried a shape too clean, too blade-like, too intentional to dismiss as coincidence. It followed me into the living room, moving with me rather than beside me, and it reminded me of how truths sometimes cling to the person trying hardest not to see them. I sat on the corner of the couch and unlocked my phone, the screen lighting my hands with a cool glow, and the sight that greeted me made my breath falter. Evidence number 4 waited in the insurance app. A timeline discrepancy that shouldn't have been possible unless someone had tried to erase what actually occurred. The trip log displayed an obvious gap, a missing minute between 03:17 and 03:18, a sliver of time erased cleanly without explanation, like a cut pulled through a strip of film. The reflection sharpens over the missing minute. The line forced itself into my thoughts, unbidden and real, binding itself to the evidence as though the motif had been waiting for this moment to reveal its true meaning. That reflection I had once brushed aside now bore down with a weight I could no longer pretend was imagination. The absence in the log radiated its own strange glow, brighter somehow than the data that surrounded it, and each second I stared at it, the truth pushed harder against the thin barrier of denial I still clung to. Darren entered the room with damp hair, droplets of water clinging to the tips and catching the low light from the hallway. He paused when he saw what I was looking at, and for a moment the air tightened between us, pulling into a sharp tension that made the metallic shadow on the wall stretch thinner longer, as though it sensed the shift. His voice softened with calculated care as he asked whether I was still stressed about that unreliable app, the word unreliable slipping from his tongue too easily, as if he'd practiced dismissing this exact form of evidence long before tonight. I told him the app didn't misplace minutes. Systems could glitch, yes, but they didn't erase time with clean precision. His expression flickered before settling into something gentler, a look meant to soothe rather than answer, but his voice sat just above a whisper, too soft to be earnest. He said fatigue could warp perception. He said nights felt longer after trauma-filled shifts. He said I needed rest, but every supposed reassurance arrived bent-shaped wrongly around a truth he was trying to smother. The shadow on the wall shifted as he stepped closer, the metallic sheen sliding across his arm in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stiffen. When he reached toward my phone, his fingertips hovered too close, as though he intended to take the device from my hand under the guise of helping me understand the real issue. I drew it back without the slightest hesitation, the movement small but firm, a quiet refusal that cracked the atmosphere more deeply than any argument could have. His jaw tightened for a fraction of a second, and in that subtle movement I recognized the man from the porch footage, the one who took what wasn't his with confidence carved into his posture. He stepped back slightly, but the shadow still clung to him, tracing the lines of his frame as if marking him with the truth he kept denying. I asked why there would be a missing minute in the log, why that precise window would disappear if nothing unusual had occurred. He claimed ignorance, but the claim rang hollow. He said maybe the system lagged, maybe the signal dropped, maybe technology was simply flawed. But the explanations felt like threads pulled from a script he'd used so often that he no longer realized how thin they had become. He moved toward the kitchen as though distance might offer him control over the narrative again, but the metallic shadow followed him across the floor, stretching farther than it should have, echoing every shift in his posture, like a reminder he couldn't outrun. I stared at the missing minute again. It wasn't just a gap. It was a silence in the data, a perfectly cut-out absence that suggested deliberate interference rather than error. It was the kind of discrepancy someone created when they thought they could rewrite reality with careful precision. And something inside me clicked into place, a sensation like a lock shifting, revealing the truth that had been sitting inches beneath the surface. When Darren returned, he kept his voice low, trying to coax me into letting the subject go for the night, but the words skated over me without sinking in. The shadow moved again as he took another step, the metallic gleam sliding across his wrist with uncanny timing, illuminating his pulse for the briefest instant before fading. He hesitated, then sensing something in me had changed. The air grew heavier, denser, as though the house itself braced for the next shift. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I didn't need to. The truth glowed from the screen in my hand, anchored by data he couldn't erase, and a reflection that refused to soften. When he walked away, the metallic shadow drifted across the room once more, stretching long and thin toward the doorway. He disappeared through like a silent witness, marking every step he took. And as the house grew quiet again, I understood with absolute clarity that lies could blur memories, but they couldn't erase time, not without leaving evidence behind. The morning arrived with a gray sky and air thick enough to feel like a warning. But I didn't expect the shift in the house to come with the sound of my father's knuckles tapping once against the front door before he stepped inside without waiting for an answer. I found him in the entryway, his rain-wet coat sleeve dripping quietly onto the floor, each drop landing with a soft tap that echoed louder than any raised voice could have. He looked at me only briefly, long enough to understand that whatever I had been holding together had begun to slip beyond my ability to contain it. He asked nothing at first, simply shrugged out of the coat with a slow, deliberate motion, hanging it over the back of the nearest chair as though he needed the room itself to brace for what was coming. The rainwater trailed down the fabric in thin lines, collecting in a small pool beneath it, each drop steady and unhurried, matching the rhythm of his controlled breathing. When Darren emerged from the hallway, he froze mid-step at the sight of my father standing there. The surprise in his expression flickered into something closer to apprehension, though he tried to hide it behind a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. He offered a hollow greeting, but my father didn't respond. Instead, he asked me to tell him exactly what had happened. His voice so calm it cut through the tension like a blade. I began with the GPS alert, the unauthorized access, the porch camera footage, the contradiction from Lorraine. The missing minute in the log, each piece spoken aloud with a steadiness I didn't know I still possessed. My father listened without interruption, his arms crossed loosely, but his jaw tightening once the only visible sign of the anger he kept contained. Darren hovered near the kitchen counter, shifting his weight between his feet, his face stiffening with each detail I recounted. When I finished, my father turned his full attention toward him and asked a single question. Why were there so many contradictions in his explanations? The air in the room thickened instantly. Darren attempted to answer, but the moment he opened his mouth, his first excuse collided with his second, neither aligning with the story he had tried to build the night before. My father didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply stepped closer, his presence carrying a force that dismantled Darren's words before they fully formed. That was when he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, opening a video file with a few quick taps. He held the screen up so both of us could see it. Evidence number 5 shop, CCTV, cam, B4 timestamp 10:02. The footage showed Darren's car idling behind my father's auto shop early that morning, parked in a space reserved strictly for repair drop-offs. The timestamp was clear, bold, and precise. 10:02, directly contradicting Darren's earlier claim that he had been home all morning. In the video, Darren stepped out of the car glancing around the same way he had in Mrs. Kent's footage, with the same measured caution that made my stomach tighten. The sight of him there on the screen again, performing the same familiar ritual of checking his surroundings before acting, made the room seem smaller. The walls inching closer as the truth settled more heavily between us. Darren tried to laugh it off, offering another hastily constructed explanation, but the laugh cracked halfway through and died abruptly, leaving behind an exposed silence that revealed more than any admission could have. My father didn't smile. He didn't blink. He simply asked Darren why he had lied about his whereabouts, why the missing minute existed, why the bank slip contradicted his story, why every piece of evidence pointed to intention rather than misunderstanding. Darren's mouth opened and closed in small, stuttering movements, each attempt at justification collapsing under the weight of the footage playing in front of him. My father stepped closer again, the presence of authority settling into the room like a shift in atmospheric pressure, and Darren took a half step back as though instinct warned him to create distance. I realized then how profoundly Darren relied on my silence on the assumption that I would doubt myself before doubting him. But standing there with my father's rain-wet coat sleeve darkening the chair fabric and the CCTV footage glowing on the screen, I felt something align in me, something I hadn't felt since long before the first lie eased its way into our home. Darren's posture began to fold inward, his shoulders drawing slightly forward, as though trying to make himself smaller against the force pressing in around him. He attempted one more explanation, a fragile combination of miscommunication and coincidence, but my father interrupted him with a quiet firmness that left no space for further distortion. He said he wasn't there to argue. He was there to understand the truth for my sake, and for the first time Darren had nothing left to offer but the hollow shell of a lie that had already been cracked open from every angle. The room held its breath, then the silence settling between the three of us like a dense fog. Outside, the rain slowed to a soft drizzle, tapping lightly against the windows, mirroring the quiet drip from my father's coat sleeve. That small pool of water beneath the chair reflected the overhead light in a way that made the surface tremble, as if echoing the instability of everything Darren had tried to piece together. My father slipped his phone back into his pocket and told Darren that the days of shifting blame were over. He said we would not continue pretending confusion explained what evidence already made plain. Darren said nothing. His silence was the first honesty I'd heard from him in days. As he stood there trapped between contradiction and consequence, I realized that the danger wasn't only in what he had done, it was in the ease with which he believed he could keep doing it. The house felt different now, not because the truth had surfaced, but because my father's presence made it impossible for Darren to bury it again. The fracture that began with a missing minute had now widened so completely that there was no way back through it. The day moved with a slow, deliberate heaviness, the kind that makes every sound feel amplified and every moment stretch too long, and even now the memory settles around me with the clarity of something I had been circling without daring to touch. After my father confronted Darren with the CCTV footage, a silence settled over the house that felt less like calm and more like the pause before something breaks. The afternoon light failed to brighten the rooms, leaving corners dim and edges blurred as if the house itself was bracing for the next truth to surface. I went to the bedroom to catch my breath, closing the door softly behind me. The dim lamp on the bedside table cast a muted glow, the kind of light that doesn't fully illuminate a space but reveals just enough to force a person to face what they've been avoiding. It flickered once before steadying the faint tremor in its bulb, casting thin shadows along the wall. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the envelope my father had left earlier, the one he had placed on the counter with a look that told me he already knew what I would find inside. The paper was cold beneath my fingers, the edges crisp, and when I unfolded it, the truth stared back with unyielding clarity. Evidence number 6. A bank slip printed in faint, uneven ink, refer V29L. The amount was small, deceptively insignificant, but the timestamp caught my eye immediately. It traced directly into the missing minute. The exact window Darren insisted was nothing more than a glitch. The dim lamp hovered a soft halo over the numbers, and I felt my pulse tighten as each detail aligned too cleanly to dismiss. The slip showed a charge linked to a device tied to Darren's login processed at 03:17:36. The missing minute wasn't a system error. It was a timeline trimmed with deliberate precision, an attempt to erase a footprint he hadn't expected anyone to find. Darren's pacing footsteps reached the bedroom doorway before his voice did. He lingered in the hall, muttering half-formed phrases about everything being overblown, about misunderstandings spiraling beyond reason. The tone was shaky, uneven, carrying the frantic edge of someone trying to rebuild a story that had already collapsed beneath them. When he finally stepped inside, the weak light from the bedroom lamp stretched across his face, splitting his expression into two uneven halves. One shadowed. One lit a visual reminder of the truth he'd been dividing and rearranging for days. His eyes landed on the slip in my hand, and something inside him recoiled. He asked where I got it, but the question held no real curiosity. It was fear disguised as confusion. His voice dropped to a pleading whisper that didn't suit him, the kind meant to elicit sympathy rather than provide explanation. I told him the slip came from a place he couldn't reach, from someone he couldn't manipulate with charm or pressure. The truth flickered across his expression, then panic, anger, calculation, all layered beneath a thin veil of denial. He took a step toward me, his hand lifting slightly as if he intended to touch my arm, reclaim authority, or reassert a sense of control he no longer possessed. The dim lamp's glow caught on his jaw, casting a jagged line of light down his cheek, and I noticed how tightly his fingers curled before he forced them open again. I shifted back without thinking, the simple movement creating a gap between us that he didn't know how to cross anymore. He tried to blame stress at work. He tried to blame exhaustion. He even tried to blame my father's involvement, calling it interference. But every word fell flat against the solid weight of the slip in my hand. That small rectangle of paper held more truth than all his explanations combined. Outside, a car door slammed. My father had returned. The sound echoed through the hall, sharp and decisive, and Darren flinched as though the noise had struck him physically. He swallowed hard, backing a step away as if distance from me could soften what the evidence had already carved into reality. The house seemed to recognize the shift, too, the dim lamp trembling lightly as if mirroring the tension hanging in the air. I folded the bank slip slowly, deliberately. It felt heavier than paper should. Darren stared at it like it was the one object in the house capable of undoing him completely, and he wasn't wrong. The truth no longer lived in shadows or suggestions or inconsistencies. It sat plainly in ink and numbers and timestamps, undeniable even in the dimmest light. And for the first time since this began, I realized that Darren wasn't afraid of what I believed. He was afraid of what he could no longer control. The evening settled around the house with a weight that felt almost physical, the kind that presses against the walls and sinks into the spaces between breaths. And even now, the memory sits in past tense with a sharpness that still finds its way into my ribs when I think about it. After the bank slip revealed more than Darren could talk his way around, the house grew unnaturally quiet, as though waiting to see whether I would finally accept the truth or continue giving him room to reshape it. I sat on the couch with my phone dimmed low, the glow casting a soft halo across my cheek, a small circle of light that felt strangely intimate against the surrounding darkness. The reflection on my skin made the room feel smaller, as if the light itself was holding me in place until I acknowledged what I'd been avoiding. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear Darren moving through the kitchen opening and closing cabinets with nervous, uneven force, the movements jittery and directionless. His footsteps shifted from one end of the room to the other, pacing the way someone does when every thought collides with the next and none provide a safe place to land. I pulled the envelope closer, the one my father had handed me earlier with a look too steady to misunderstand, and slid my fingers inside. Evidence number 7. The confrontation note he had written in his blunt, angled handwriting. Note G3. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Its corners slightly softened from being folded and unfolded several times, as though my father had rehearsed how to hand it to me. The note listed times Darren had been seen driving a car he claimed never to have touched, brief descriptions of his behavior around the shop, moments that contradicted every explanation he had tried to offer. It included 2 names, people who had confirmed what they witnessed without hesitation, and a short line at the bottom written in my father's clipped script, "Patterns don't lie, even when people do." The words settled over me like a quiet verdict. Darren stepped into the doorway when he realized I was reading it, his posture tight and hunched in a way I hadn't seen before. His eyes flicked between my face and the paper, calculating how much I had processed, how deep the damage ran, and what angle he might still use to soften it. For the first time, none of his expressions landed the way they used to. His confusion looked like fear, his frustration like exposure, his attempts at calm more like the tremors of someone trying to steady a foundation already cracked through. He took one hesitant step forward, then another, stopping only when he noticed the glow from my phone brushing the side of my cheek. The light caught in his peripheral vision, and I saw something shift in him, a recognition that the small circle of illumination served as proof that I was no longer standing in shadow, no longer letting him darken the truth before I could see it clearly. He reached out, palm open, as though he could simply take the note from my hand and fold away everything it revealed. I didn't move. His fingers hovered in the air between us, suspended in a space that used to hold trust, but now held something brittle and unspoken. The phone light reflected off my cheek again, and he blinked at the sharp contrast it created, as if seeing me clearly now unsettled him more than the evidence itself. He tried speaking, then words tumbling out in uneven fragments, claims of misunderstanding, of coincidences, of stress bending reality into shapes that weren't fair to hold against him. He talked about pressure at work, about trying to keep us steady, about making mistakes that weren't as intentional as they looked. But every sentence stuttered, collided, folded into itself, because none of them matched the timeline my father had documented with quiet precision. When he finally asked if I believed him, the room fell still. My father's footsteps echoed faintly from the hallway as he returned steady and unhurried, a reminder that truth didn't need to raise its voice to eclipse everything else. Darren tensed instantly as if the sound alone carried consequences he wasn't prepared to face. He stepped back from me, the motion small but telling, and his eyes darted toward the hall before shifting back to the note in my hand. The space between us grew heavier, the kind of heaviness that signals a breaking point disguised as a quiet moment. I looked at him, then really looked, and realized how much of my silence he had relied on, how deeply he needed me to doubt myself, to soften the edges of his actions, to bend my memory, so his version of events could still fit inside it. But the evidence no longer lived in suggestion or implication. It lived in timestamps, witness accounts, data logs, ink that hadn't faded, and now in my father's unmistakable handwriting. I folded note number G3 slowly, watching how Darren's breathing hitched with each crease, and set it beside me on the couch. It didn't matter that it wasn't an official report. It was truth in a form he couldn't distort. He whispered my name like a plea, but the sound felt hollow, stripped of the familiarity it once carried. The phone light trembled slightly on my cheek as my hand shifted, and in its reflection I saw him for what he was. Not a man confused or overwhelmed, but a man cornered by the very lies he had wrapped around both of us. I told him clearly, and without raising my voice, that I would not ignore the evidence anymore. His face tightened almost imperceptibly, the last piece of denial slipping through his expression before collapsing entirely. The room changed then subtly, but absolutely. It no longer felt like a space he controlled through charm or misdirection. It felt like mine, quiet, wounded, but no longer blind. My father's shadow stretched across the doorway as he stepped into view, the weight of the house shifting in his direction. Darren didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply looked at the note beside me, the proof he couldn't erase, and I watched the last remnants of his confidence drain from his posture. The phone's dim light cooled slowly against my skin. The evening pulled itself tighter around us, and the truth finally unmasked settled between us with the stillness of something that could no longer be undone. The house felt unnaturally still that night, the kind of stillness that makes every breath sound too loud and every movement feel like it might fracture the air. I followed my father into the living room, the dim light stretching long shadows across the floor, each one pulling at the edges of the truth. We were moments away from confronting. Darren stood near the center of the room, his posture stiff, his expression caught somewhere between panic and denial. I could see the way his throat worked as he swallowed, the twitch at the corner of his jaw, the subtle tremor in his fingers. He knew something was coming, but he had no idea how much. I brushed my thumb against the edge of the paper I'd held earlier, the one that had sliced my skin without warning, and the faint sting pulsed again, a small but precise reminder of how truth can cut even when you think you're prepared for it. The paper edge cutting my finger had left a thin, pale line, and now the sting seemed to sharpen with each second that passed. I pressed my hand against my leg to steady it as my father took a seat, placing his phone on the table with quiet finality. He didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. The silence he held carried more weight than any accusation Darren could have anticipated. Darren attempted a breathless explanation, words like misunderstanding, exaggeration, heat of the moment slipping from his mouth in fragmented attempts at control, but my father lifted his hand once barely, and Darren's voice died mid-sentence. My father tapped the phone. The screen brightened. Then he pressed play. Audio file R final. length 148. The first voice on the recording was Darren's calm, confident, unguarded, in the way people become only when they believe they aren't being watched or recorded. He spoke plainly about the keys, about how easily I could be manipulated into believing I had misplaced them, about how predictable I was when confused or tired. His voice didn't waver. It didn't hesitate. It carried a tone I had never heard from him before, strategic, self-assured, cruel. Then came Lorraine's voice, smooth and cold, layered with the kind of superiority she only ever hinted at in person. She told him he was right, that I needed to be put in place, that letting me think I'd been forgetful would remind me where the balance of the marriage truly belonged. She urged him to take the car, to do it in a way that would make me question my own memory. Her laugh, polished, quiet, deliberate, slid across the room like ice water. At 32 seconds in, Darren detailed the exact timing, how he accessed the GPS, how he cleared the minute from the insurance log, how he waited until I'd be too exhausted to question anything. The precision of his instructions, the calm certainty in each word, cut deeper than any confrontation could have. Every sentence was a confession laid bare in his own voice, uncoerced, undistorted, unmistakable. My father didn't look at me as the recording played. He kept his gaze on Darren, his expression unreadable, his body still in a way that signaled profound, controlled anger. Darren's breathing turned uneven. His face tightened with each word coming from the phone. When his own voice described me as easy to steer, a tremor ran visibly through him. When his mother laughed in agreement, he took a step back as if the sound had struck him physically. The recording reached its final seconds, Lorraine asking if he'd gotten the keys yet, and Darren assuring her he had a plan she won't fight. Then the file fell silent, and the room echoed with the emptiness left behind. No one moved. No one breathed. I felt the sting in my finger intensify, a small pulse that grounded me in the enormity of what we'd just heard. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't pressure. It wasn't a mistake. It was a conspiracy crafted with precision and confidence, spoken in their own voices without hesitation. Darren tried to speak first. His mouth opened, but the words came out tangled, desperate, stripped of the smoothness he usually wielded like a tool. He said it wasn't what it sounded like, that he was venting, that he exaggerated, that his mother misunderstood, that he hadn't meant it literally. But the excuses tripped over each other, collapsing the second they left his lips. The recording had robbed him of every angle he used to manipulate truth into something softer. My father leaned forward slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even change his tone. He simply told Darren that the truth was now documented, undeniable, and complete. He said that the time for shifting blame was over. Darren's face drained of color. His knees softened as though the floor beneath him had tilted without warning. He reached toward me, fingers trembling, whispering my name as if a single word could undo everything that had been revealed. But I didn't move. The sting in my finger, the weight of the recording, the hollow echo of Lorraine's laugh, none of it left space for sympathy. The truth lay exposed in the center of the room, unalterable and sharp. And Darren, finally stripped of every lie he had tried to hide behind, stood frozen inside the wreckage of his own making. The silence that followed the recording didn't feel like silence at all. It felt like a pressure in the air thick enough to press against my chest and settle in the corners of the room like dust that had been waiting years to fall. Darren stood in that silence with his mouth half open. His breath stuck somewhere between a plea and a denial. But there were no lies left for him to reach for. Every angle he used to twist the truth had collapsed under the weight of his own voice. My father didn't move at first. He sat there with his elbows resting lightly on his knees. His hands clasped his expression, the steady kind he used when someone's life depended on him thinking before acting. Then he straightened slowly, slipped a cigarette from behind his ear, an old habit he kept even though he almost never smoked indoors, and placed it between his fingers. He didn't light it. He didn't need to. The presence of it alone was enough to silence whatever trembling excuse Darren had been about to offer. A fleck of cigarette ash clung stubbornly to the paper tube, trembling slightly with each shift in the room's tension. My father spoke in a tone that didn't rise above conversational, but it carried the weight of a verdict. He told Darren he had crossed lines that weren't meant to bend: ethical, moral, personal. He listed each violation with the precision of someone who had spent the past 40 years understanding exactly where the boundaries of decency stood. He reminded Darren of the evidence: the unauthorized GPS access, the porch camera footage, the crafted lie from Lorraine, the missing minute in the log, the bank slip aligned perfectly with that gap, the shop CCTV at 10:02, the confrontation note, and finally, the recording, the final truth that stripped the story down to its raw and ugly bones. Darren tried again weakly to counter something, anything, but my father lifted 2 fingers barely an inch, and the words died in his throat. My father told him that manipulating me was one thing, but constructing a conspiracy with his mother to erode my sense of reality was another. He said the kind of man who chips away at a woman's trust is a man who has forgotten his own spine. Darren flinched as if struck. My father reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded document, placing it on the coffee table with the controlled calm of someone placing a scalpel on a surgical tray. The sound it made, barely more than a soft tap, cut through the room more sharply than any shout. It was a separation agreement drafted with the help of a legal friend, outlining restitution, the return of my car, the division of property, and Darren's immediate removal from the house. "You're going to sign it," my father said, "and you're going to leave tonight." Darren's face drained so quickly it looked as though the color itself had fled. He shook his head once, barely weakly, but my father didn't shift. He leaned back slightly, cigarette still between his fingers, the ash trembling but never falling. He told Darren that if he refused the recording, and all 7 preceding pieces of evidence would be sent directly to an attorney in the morning. And if Darren tried to involve Lorraine, he would be reminded that her voice was on the recording as well, implicating herself with a confidence that now looked reckless. Darren's shoulders sank, collapsing inward like the weight of consequence had finally found its way into his bones. He whispered that he hadn't meant harm, that things had spiraled, that he never thought it would go this far. But my father cut through it with a single question: "How far did you think it should have gone?" Darren had no answer. I felt a steadiness forming deep in my spine, something like a pulse of clarity that had been dormant for too long. Hearing my father say the words I had been afraid to speak out loud broke something open inside me, not painfully, but cleanly, like a fracture finally resetting into its rightful alignment. I told Darren that trust wasn't something he could carve apart and rearrange to suit his convenience. I told him that every lie he'd spoken had chipped away at something I hadn't realized was breakable until it shattered in front of me. He stared at me with a kind of desperate disbelief, as though he'd expected a softer version of me to appear, the version he had depended on for years, the one who smoothed things over and questioned her own memory before questioning him. But that version of me was gone, dissolving with the last remnants of the lies he'd fed me. My father placed a pen beside the document. The cigarette ash finally loosened and drifted to the floor in a soft gray curl. The moment felt final, like a curtain falling at the end of a long and unwanted performance. Darren's hand trembled as he picked up the pen. He signed. And with that single movement, everything he had built on deceit collapsed completely. He left the house with nothing but the jacket he'd worn inside. No keys, no car, no control. The door closed behind him, and the sound echoed through the house like a breath finally released after being held too long. The house is quiet in a way that feels new, as though the walls themselves have finally stopped bracing for impact, and the present tense settles around me like a clean breath after days spent holding air in my lungs. Morning light slips through the blinds in thin stripes that lie gently across the floor, soft instead of fractured, steady instead of trembling. A small mirror shard rests on the counter where I set it last night after cleaning up the broken frame that once held a photo of us. It catches the sunlight, casting a bright, narrow gleam that slides across the wall and holds perfectly still. The reflection finally holds steady. I stand in the center of the living room and notice how different my body feels inside this space, as if my muscles have been carrying a weight I didn't realize was there until the moment it lifted. My breathing moves easily, naturally, unforced, and the silence no longer feels like a threat waiting to unfold. It feels like possibility. The rooms around me look the same, but nothing in them carries the tension they held before. The shadows are soft again, not sharp or looming, and for the first time in weeks, I can look at the corners without wondering what truth might be hiding in them. I walk to the hallway, noticing how the air shifts gently instead of pressing in. The walls don't seem to lean forward anymore, and the flickering bulb above the entryway burns with a calm, steady glow instead of that erratic pulse that once felt like a warning. It lights the space without shaking, without slicing shadows into uneven pieces. It feels like the house is breathing with me, matching its rhythm to mine, rather than forcing me to match its tension. When I open the front door, the cold morning air moves past me in a clean sweep, carrying away whatever remnants of the past night still cling to the edges of the house. My father stands on the porch, his arms crossed lightly, the same way he stood the night everything finally unraveled. He doesn't need to step inside to know the weight in the rooms has changed. He reads it in my posture, in the way I stand without tightening my hands or bracing my shoulders. He asks if I slept, and I nod. It isn't a lie. It isn't a performance. I slept without waking to shadows bending across the hallway, or the subtle fear that something in the dark might confirm another truth I wasn't ready to face. My father rests a hand on my shoulder, steady and warm, then tells me he'll be around if I need anything. He doesn't linger, doesn't offer advice or warnings. He simply gives me the certainty that I'm not standing alone in the aftermath. When the door closes behind him, it clicks with a clarity that feels final but not heavy. I walk into the garage where my car sits exactly where it belongs, the keys I reclaimed resting on the small table beside it. I pick them up and feel the subtle weight settle into my palm, familiar, grounded mine. The metal catches the light and sends a small shimmer across the garage wall, a thin line of brightness that doesn't distort or shake. I trace my thumb across the key's grooves and feel the steadiness of the present anchor itself inside my chest. I lock the house, listening to the mechanism shift cleanly into place, each part aligning the way it's supposed to. There's no tension behind the sound, no threat hidden in its echo. The morning sun brightens the edges of the pathway outside, and for a moment I stand still, letting the warmth graze my face. Nothing trembles, nothing flickers, nothing hides. I return inside, passing the counter where the mirror shard lies, catching daylight in its fractured surface. I lift it carefully, turning it in my fingers, watching the steady glow ripple through the broken glass without distorting. The shard doesn't feel like a remnant of something shattered. It feels like proof that pieces can still reflect clearly once the source of distortion is gone. I set it back down gently, letting it rest beneath the sunlight so it can do what it couldn't do before, reflect without trembling. The house moves around me in soft creaks and quiet breaths, not as a warning, but as a living space adjusting to the absence of chaos. It feels lighter, spacious, almost unfamiliar in the best possible way. I walk through each room slowly, recognizing how different everything feels when fear isn't coiled beneath the surface. The silence is comfortable now, the kind that invites thought instead of drowning it. I open a window and let fresh air move through the rooms, letting it lift the dusty remnants of tension that had settled in the corners. The curtains sway lightly, their motion gentle instead of frantic, and the world outside pours into the house with a soft, steady rhythm. When I return to the living room, the mirror shard glows again, unwavering. The present holds still around me, not as a moment suspended by fear, but as a space regained, a clarity earned. I sit down, letting the truth of everything that has happened settle, not as weight, but as distance. The house feels like mine again. My life does too. And for the first time in a long time, nothing inside or outside me is pretending to be anything other than what it is. The reflection on the wall remains steady, and so do I.